This is the On Humans podcast with your host, Ivari Mäkelä. And welcome back to the second part on the exploration of the origins of modern India. This is a part of a larger project at On Humans where I search for ways to broaden our understanding of the human story by pushing this kind of a macro history beyond its quite obvious traditional focus on what happens in the West. I started with a set of episodes on China last year and followed up with one episode on East Asian history more broadly. And I hope to produce more of these, but this is the second and last one on India. Don't worry if you haven't listened to the ones that I just mentioned, and don't even worry if you haven't listened to part one of this India series. This one stands on its own feet. But my guest is, again, Bishnupriya Gupta, the author of The Economic History of India, a book which is just a wonderful piece of scholarship, in my opinion, trying to understand the story of India from the point of view not of kings and queens, but by looking at the living standards of the average person. So in part one, Gupta took us over the age of empires from the height of the Mughal Empire around year 1600. All the way to the end of the British rule. And her research really just has revealed some striking patterns from this period, especially about the role of the British rule, and I think it's super important in bringing clarity and nuance into one of the most heated topics in all of history. So do follow up with that if you haven't listened to that yet. But today we're going to turn into India during independence. We're going to talk about the legacy of British colonialism. We're going to talk about reasons why India fell behind the economic miracle of East Asian countries like China or South Korea. But we also talk about some of the successes of the world's largest democracy in heading its way forward during this time. And as always, we finish with my guest's reflection on humanity. If you enjoy this, as always, do subscribe, do leave a 5-star review, and share it on social media or with a friend. I also want to thank all my Patreon supporters for their commitment to making my work a little bit more sustainable and more rewarding. Thank you so much to everyone who pledges their support there. And if you're a long-term listener and want to join the wonderful group of people, you can head to patreon.com/onhumans. But let's get the show started. So without further ado, I bring to you, one more time, Bishnupriya Gupta. Okay, we are back with Bishnupriya Gupta, now focusing on the era of independence. You mentioned at the very end of the part one that the British were very keen on educating a small, very well-educated Indian elite. So there's a lot of money put into universities compared to broad-based primary education. And you argue that this has really impacted what Indian economy is like today. And specifically, it might explain why there's so many more made in China products than made in India products, but why so many, IT centers are based in India rather than China. So why don't you walk us through that story?
So the higher education bias of a colonial education policy could be used favorably by certain groups in society at that time. So let me just broadly mention the caste system. And here, certain groups of people had to be literate because they needed literacy for their occupations. So think of the Brahmins as the priests. They needed to read the religious texts. Think of the traders. They had to maintain their accounting books. So these groups with these types of occupations within the caste system had a natural desire to get educated and often got educated because it was necessary for their jobs. Now, when modern education came along, these groups had the advantage to be able to enter into new occupations. So the new modern occupations that came up, like lawyers, doctors, engineers.
So even if the British wouldn't have themselves been like, well, we're going to use a caste system in our recruiting, they would end up enforcing the caste system because it's the literate people who will be educated.
Exactly. So there was kind of an interaction between the objectives of the British government and the society itself, where certain groups benefited from this system. So one indicator which Steve Broadberry and I kind of looked at is if you look at output per worker, which is kind of the standard measure of productivity, and do it by sector, you will find that the service sector in India always was higher than the other sectors. And I think a part of this is because they were doing slightly more qualified jobs, but their education was an input into these jobs. So they had much more higher productivity. And if we look at the Indian economy today, you'll see very similar patterns. The service sector productivity is a lot higher in India than productivity in industry, and certainly compared to agriculture. So this kind of the education system reinforced the initial inequalities that existed by pumping all the resources into higher education rather than trying to educate the whole population. So if I may kind of look at East Asia, which is something you had brought up before, and Japan as a colonizer, like, I'm not saying Japan was a very benevolent colonizer.
No, let's leave the violence aside and focus on the policy. Yes.
It suited their imperial interests to invest in agriculture in the colonies because they wanted to import rice from the colonies. And therefore, they wanted to develop irrigation facilities, put in place a more kind of equal distribution of land. All this helped the Japanese to increase agricultural productivity in the colonies. They also translated their own education system, which was very primary education focused, to the colonies for very similar reasons. It helped them to get workforce who were educated. So the East Asian colonies, when they became independent, started with a much higher level of literacy for the population than India did. And then, of course, the East Asian economies have invested a lot on education as well, in a much more primary education focused way.
Yeah, much more kind of education for everyone rather than the Indian good education for the best.
Exactly.
That's really interesting. A couple of questions on that, though. One is, it's true that if we focus on, for example, South Korea here versus India, or Taiwan versus India, that story makes perfect sense. What about Bangladesh? Bangladesh was part of the same colonial, British India. There's much more made in Bangladesh stuff than there is made in India stuff. I haven't seen the exact numbers, but Bangladesh is often seen as a kind of manufacturing country. How does that relate to the story?
So I don't have a very good answer to it, but one thing I will kind of speculate on is that if you look at where were the universities of colonial India, this was Calcutta. This was in Bombay. This was in Madras. And Bangladesh is a much newer country with newer universities, newer education system. So it is possible they were able to change the policies in a way that, they have been very good at promoting education of girls, um, trying to make it much more universal than as a policy. So it's something I'm speculating on. I don't know enough about it.
Well, then to put my own cards on the table a little bit, I was delighted to see that you discuss education as perhaps one of the main reasons. That's been my go-to explanations ever since I started really digging into the topic. But I have two questions on that. One is, how do we explain the primary education, the better literacy, for example, in East Asia than in South Asia, India and its neighbors? And then I have another question about policy, which is the other go-to explanation, that they just had better policy. So let's focus first on the education. It makes a lot of sense what you said if we compare, for example, South Korea to India. But what if we compare China, which is, of course, what most people want to focus on? And there's a wonderful TED talk by one of my past guests, Yasheng Huang, where he addresses the question of why did China grow so much faster than India? And he's very unsatisfied with people who say that it was because China was undemocratic and India was democratic. And he instead makes the very similar argument than you do when comparing India and South Korea, which that it was all about literacy. The literacy rates in China were astronomical compared to India before the economic takeoff. So there was kind of a lot of gas in the economic tank of China, so that when the policies got kind of right, they were able to rise. And of course, the Japanese are not to be given merit for this. Rather, what Yasheng Huang argues is that this is a very, very long legacy where the civil service exams in East Asia were used as the main path to social mobility. Political power was won not with sword, but with the pen. and broad-based appreciation of literacy and education was kind of part of the East Asian ethos, not only in China, but also, for example, in Korea. So how much do you think that this higher literacy, higher what economists often call human capital in East Asia versus India and its neighbors, how much do you think that might actually be something that has a very, very long roots in, like Yasheng Huang argues, versus something that you find in the kind of recent differences in Japanese and British colonial policy?
So that's a very interesting point, and I haven't thought about it before so much. But when we were talking about the caste system, you get the opposite of it. So
Yes.
within this civil service exam system, you had an inbuilt path to social mobility.
Yeah, it was only sexist.
And only say, I was going to say that it was only going to be men. But in the Indian system, it is only men to a large extent because of you look at the comparative literacy figures there, like the difference is huge. But it had an inbuilt mechanism in the opposite direction, that if you are literate and upper caste, you stay literate and upper caste, and you get all the advantages. So that's a very good point, I think, that when you have a culture of social mobility built in through the education system, um, what happens as a consequence? And I think I hadn't thought of it before, but I think it's a good point.
So in a sense, the Japanese and British different education policies might have, in some curious sense, kind of just enforced trends that were already there.
Exactly. No, absolutely. I mean,
Excellent. Well, let's then turn into policy, because as I said, I personally have been very, very heavily in favor of this education-based, literacy-based, human capital argument for the rise of the East Asian economies. But there is another story. There's another story, which is that, look, economies do badly when there's too much government control. When you liberalize, you get takeover. And that's what the East Asian countries did well. And you see that in Indian case, according to this story, is that during the Nehru years and later until the 80s, so the first few decades of independence, you had too much government intervention, and there's been a little bit of pro-market reforms, and India has taken. How much do you think, what do you think of that story as a whole when you look at the actual level of government intervention in these countries? How much has it been too much government versus wrong kind of government when things haven't worked out?
no, that's a very important question, and in some sense, I wanted to um, say something about it in my book. So most of the debate on Indian, recent economic failure and success, that is post-independence, kind of starts at 1950, and then it goes forward, and nobody thinks of what happened before.
Or they think about it in a very separate debate about railways and how bad were the British or whatnot.
Exactly. It's a separate debate. But when you look at Indian, let's say GDP per capita, which is what we've talked about a lot, from 1950 to 2000, the Nehruvian period, or the first 30 years of Congress rule, it don't look very good, because there's 2% growth as opposed to 5-6% goal growth elsewhere. So you look at that and say, look, this is a huge policy failure of this interventionist government of Nehru, which brought in industrial regulation, which got brought in tariffs, etc. What I've tried to do in the book is to look at the long run. So let's compare 1900 to 2000. And then the whole picture is different, because you have almost zero rate of growth from 1900 to 1950. And then you have a 2% rate of growth after 1950. And that is a structural break statistically. So when you do exercises of statistical breaks for 100 years, you get the break point at 1952. If you look at 1950 to 2000, you get the break point in 1980. And that is, in some sense, why a historical perspective lets you see things in a very different context. And have different interpretation of the same thing becomes really important.
So Nehru was, yes, not bringing the kind of growth that you've seen later and that you saw in China later, but it did bring a break from the complete stagnation during the British rule.
Absolutely. And what also is true at this point in 1950 is the Congress was planning for a long time, and the Congress was very closely aligned with various industrial groups, like the Birlas in particular, but also others. Um, and they talked about how India should develop when it gets independence. And I don't think there was opposition to the government taking a proactive role.
So the industry, the people in the industry themselves welcomed an active role.
Exactly, because at that
Interesting.
point, they were not sure where they were going to invest, because they were kind of unsure of investing in high-tech sectors or tech sectors that required a lot of investment. This market was not well known to them. So they quite they were not against the role of the public sector. You see a similar narrative in the context of South Korea. But here, the government played a different policy role. What they did was they set goals towards some sectors. So the South Korean government wanted to develop the heavy and chemical industries, where they gave lots of incentive to the private sector to step in and develop. So tax breaks, easy credit, but they also made exports a target. So all kinds of incentives. The Nehru did it in a different way, saying we are going to get the public sector to play a big role in certain heavy investment industries, and the private sector paid. So there was a heavy regulation. I don't think all aspects of this regulation were good because it did bring in inefficiency. And the main problem was that the regulation lasted not just for a short period of time. Like if you look at South Korea again, there was protection for all of the 1950s. They had a very protective economy, but they opened up thereafter. Whereas what India did was to stay protectionist for a very long time, which kind of didn't incentivize the private sector to get its full potential. So when it did this in 1980 by removing the regulation on private sector investment, you see a huge response of the private sector. It's not that the private sector ever opposed in the beginning the importance of the public sector as the driver.
Am I hearing you right that in a way it's not that there is either government is good or government is bad? I mean, the government, it depends what the government does. And in many ways, there was a policy failure, in some sense, would you say? Or there was a lack of optimal policy compared to South Korea. The Indian government took a certain kind of role, which proved to be not so efficient at generating, for example, export-led industries. They ended up, there's a lot of technicalities around what kind of a role they played, but you say that we've emphasized maybe often too much whether the government role was big or small, and not enough whether the government role was wise or unwise.
So I think there are two things. One is the South Korea's political context is very different from India. So we can't just say, okay, they should have done it, given that it's extremely different as its political setup, the political context. So
And the literacy context, like we
and
discussed
the
earlier.
literacy
Yeah.
context. But I think for India, one thing is really important, that at the end of the Second World War, it's not just India, it's many other countries who were talking about this. Why are we in the periphery? That's the term that was used. Just satellites of the Western industrial countries. We are just supplying them raw material and food, and importing all the industrial goods. Our prosperity lies in industrializing. And this is a sentiment which was echoed in the United States by Alexander Hamilton. It was echoed in Germany by Friedrich List. So it's not a new thing that, industrializing is the main way to develop, not just economically, but also get national prestige. So all the governments in the newly independent countries were trying to do industrialize. And the best way they could do it was in the Indian context. The Nehruvian view was, um, let's look at the Soviet Union, which was still had a high prestige in the international sphere, just having come out of the Second World War. Let's follow the Soviet model and let's just do this public sector development, like prioritize the public sector, the capital goods sector,
Capital goods being things like making machines rather than making toys.
machineries, exactly. Make machinery that will, increase the rate of investment, not just in industry, but also give agriculture, tractors, etc. So this is the way forward. Let's do it this way. We don't know how the private sector will respond, so let's just get public sector to be proactive. Now, this policy could have been shorter lived than it was, and that might have changed things. It lasted for a long period of time, and India got more and more uncompetitive, being kind of protected from the world market. And I think that was a problem of industrialization. But there was also this problem of having a workforce which wasn't that educated, and nothing much was done to change this. So, to me, I think Nehru was an incredible visionary. Did some fantastic things, but on education, I don't see the policies to be that proactive. One reason could be that this was already like a state budget. It was in the state policy domain. So the central government didn't really do much here. That's possible. But whatever it is, it was the, the education aspect to me is extremely important.
How much do you think that politics stood in the way of prosperity in India in the following sense? Um, for example, during the British rule, the Swadeshi movement was a huge part of kind of Indian political consciousness, meaning boycotting British goods, boycotting, or actually not only British goods, but boycotting all exports, with this idea that the empire is draining India and that India will become strong by developing their own industries and also boycott British goods, which would then force them to listen to us. And many see that as I think as a relatively successful political project. But that of course leaves within it this kind of anti-trade sentiment, I would presume. So how much, and Gandhi certainly was not saying, oh, what we're going to do if we become independent is we're going to have an export-led industry, supplying Western countries with cheap toys or whatever the East Asian countries started with. So it's, how much do you think that there is a sense in which just the politics, the political backdrop led India into this kind of not trade-friendly consciousness, where trading to become prosperous was seen perhaps as a somehow not in as favorable light as it might have in a more neutral political context.
So I clearly, I definitely think that um, the colonial context was important. The lack of growth for 50 years, the lack of education, the lack of prosperity in agriculture, all these were factors which made um, Indians, in a wider sense, not just Nehru and the Congress and so on, to think that what is a different model of development. And this was very much the political context, not just of India of the time. It's a period of decolonization. Country after country adopted the same policies. And what you see in East Asian countries is something very different. It doesn't happen everywhere else, and it could be their proximity to Japan and having played an important role in Japan's war as well. Right, they were producing a lot of the industrial goods during the Second World War, because Japan was fighting the war, and North Korea in particular had a lot of production of war-related industries. So when Korea was divided, North Korea was actually a more developed part of the country than South Korea. And so it simply could be the geographical differences, the proximity to the colonizer and the context of colonization, which created these different views. But definitely in most of the colonies in Africa and Asia, the ultimate goal was to industrialize. And whatever policies they thought would help it were adopted. I mean, I think the mistake uh, was not to get rid of many of these policies of, having import licenses, having industrial licenses for a very long time. So one other kind of benefit of the Nehruvian policies was, if you look at inequality, you'll see that it was very high in the British period, the colonial period, but then it declined during the Nehruvian period, and that's mainly because of this big role given to the public sector as opposed to the private sector. And it's since then, under the private sector led development path, inequality has risen again quite significantly in India, although hasn't gone back to the colonial level yet. And I have that in my book. I find it really interesting that you have all these growth related problems during the Nehruvian period, but on one dimension it does actually delivers is on the inequality side.
And I guess that's why the primary education is such a key puzzle, because that's one of the few ways in which you can invest in something that is guaranteed to bring you both growth, and it's an inequality reducing action.
I mean, having said that, if you look at measures of poverty, how many people are below the poverty line. A lot of people have been moved out of the poverty line since the economic reforms. As growth has been higher, many more people have come out of poverty, though not enough. I mean, if you look at India and China in comparison, China has done so much better. But there is evidence that the poverty reduction is also related to growth. So the fast growing provinces have seen uh, faster reduction in poverty. So so the story is kind of complicated, but I think your broad point about education, I think that's absolutely key to everything.
Okay, well, before we finish, my final question to our guests is, how has all your research shaped your outlook on humanity?
That's an incredibly good question. And, I don't know whether I have a very good answer, but I think to me, what matters really is inequality. I mean, growth, of course, everybody wants to grow. I mean, when we hear about we want to grow, like who doesn't want to grow? But I think the main issue for policymakers today is inequality. We live in a world full of inequalities, not just within countries, but also across countries. And this is something, policymakers have to deal with. Otherwise, I don't see how conflicts can go away, or so many awful things that happen today, how those can go away. So to me, inequality seems to be the most important factor that policymakers should target.
Professor Bishnupriya Gupta, thank you so much for your research, your great book, and your generous time today.
Thank you so much for having me on your program.
Okay, that was it for today. Thanks for sticking with us until the very end. I hope that you enjoyed it. If you did, definitely do check out the What About China series from last September if you haven't listened to that yet. But especially do stay tuned. Something very exciting is happening on this feed very soon. During March, I will be launching something that's been brewing for almost a year now, which is a 5-episode series on the origins of humankind. It's a set of episodes that I've worked very hard with some wonderful people from the UC San Diego who work with human origins, especially Professor Pascal Gagnon, who's been consulting and helping me plan this series. So it's gonna be quite something. I don't think in the podcasting space you'll find anything quite like it. We start with the origin of life. We go to Australopithecines, Homo erectus, beginning of Homo sapiens, the spread of our species, the extinction of our cousins, and eventually to the transformation of world under agriculture. It's going to be quite a set in length and depth. It will be very similar to an audiobook, but it will be all available for free here There will also be written summaries at onhumans.substack.com. And if you prefer to watch video, these conversations will also be available on YouTube. So stay tuned for the origins of humankind this March, here at On Humans. Until then, take care.